They wanted me to sell the farm before I found the names they buried in Orville's barn.
Lorena Castle was 65 years old. The morning a room full of people looked at everything Orville had built with his hands and decided it was worth less than their patience. She had arrived at Harlan County's single legal office 12 minutes early, which was not unusual for her. 38 years of nursing had made punctuality a reflex, something her body did without instruction. She parked her car under the one oak tree in the lot, turned off the engine, and sat for a moment before going inside. Through the windshield, the sky over eastern Kentucky was the gray of old pewter, holding the cold without releasing it. She had driven this stretch of road hundreds of times over the years, first as a young woman learning the county, then as a nurse who knew which families lived behind which mailboxes and what kinds of trouble waited behind which doors. The road looked the same as it always had. What was different was the reason she was on it. The waiting room smelled of copy paper and burnt coffee. A wall calendar showed a photograph of Red River Gorge October's page still up, even though it was the second week of November. Lorena took a seat near the window, set her handbag on her knees, and watched the room fill. She noticed Preston Drury before she counted the chairs. He was already inside, standing near the receptionist's desk, speaking in a low and pleasant voice to the young woman who managed the office files. He wore a pressed shirt and the kind of jacket that cost real money, but was cut to look casual. He laughed once at something the young woman said, touched the edge of her desk briefly with 2 fingers, and then turned and found a seat near the front, as if he had been there all along. It was 20 minutes before the appointment time. Lorena did not write anything down. She only looked the way she had learned to look in emergency rooms, in slow-moving hospital corridors, at the things that arrived too early or moved too quietly to belong naturally to the moment. In 38 years, she had learned that the most important information in a room was rarely the information being presented. It was the information arranging itself in the margins. Preston Drury was margin information. Orville Castle had been her husband's older brother. He had never been an easy man. When she brought him soup during the bad winter 3 years ago, he accepted it without looking up from the frame he was mending and said only that it needed more salt. When she drove him to the county clinic for his knee, he sat silent the entire way, as if acknowledging her presence would have cost him something. He was the kind of man who expressed gratitude through proximity rather than words, who showed trust by continuing to sit in the same room as you rather than by saying anything about it. But 4 months before he died, she had stopped by the property unannounced and found him in the doorway of his barn, working a piece of wood with his hands. He had not looked up right away. When he did, he said the one thing she had not expected from him. "You're the kind of person who checks on people, Rena. That's rarer than you think." Then he went back to his work. She had driven home with that sentence sitting in the passenger seat beside her, and she had never been entirely sure what to do with it. It was not the kind of compliment that resolved anything. It was the kind that opened a question you had not thought to ask. Now Orville was gone, and the room was filling with his relatives. Warren Beale came in with his wife Patrice, who wore new boots and an expression of careful sympathy. Warren was 44, stocky, with the kind of confidence that comes from never having been seriously wrong about anything important. He nodded at Lorena across the room, the way you nod at someone standing in a line acknowledging position without warmth. Patrice followed his lead, managing a smile that began and ended at the same distance from her eyes. Celia Drury arrived with Preston, who had gone back to the parking lot to meet her. She was 48, well-dressed, and carried herself like a woman who had long ago decided that softness was optional. She greeted 2 of the cousins by name, air-kissed a woman Lorena did not recognize, and sat down without looking in Lorena's direction at all. The lawyer, a thin man named Alderman, who had been practicing in Harlan County since before most of the people in the room were born, came out at exactly the appointed time. He read without theater or ceremony. Orville James Castle, being of sound mind. The house on Kettle Creek Road, built 1947, with its contents and outbuildings. The eastern lot, 2.1 acres, to his cousin Raymond. The truck, the savings account of moderate size, various smaller items, to various people whose names Lorena did not know well enough to attach faces to. She heard her own name near the end. The remainder of the home property. 4 acres including the residence, the outbuildings, and the apiary. Celia Drury made a sound. It was small and quickly contained a sound that started as a laugh and was shaped into something more presentable before it fully escaped. But it escaped, and once it was in the room, it gave permission to others. "Oh, honey," Celia said, not quite to Lorena, Not quite to the room, but in the precise space between that ensured everyone could hear. Orville always did have a soft spot for strays. Someone near the back let a breath out through their nose that was not quite laughter, but served the same function. Lorena heard it. She felt the attention of the room settle on her, briefly a collective assessment, and then move on. She recognized this kind of attention from long experience. It was the attention of people deciding that your situation was your problem, and that their acknowledgement of it was already more than you should have expected. Warren leaned forward slightly in his chair, his voice taking on a tone of practical concern that he had probably rehearsed. Lorena, those property taxes on 4 acres with the house in the condition it's in, are you sure you can manage all that alone? The word alone was not cruel. It was worse than cruel. It was reasonable. Lorena kept her hands still on her handbag. She had spent 38 years learning to keep her hands still. When she needed to think, when a patient's chart said one thing and the patient's face said something else, when the right response required silence instead of reflex. She looked at Warren steadily and said nothing. Warren was the kind of man who mistook silence for agreement, which meant his certainty was in part built on other people's restraint. She was not going to be the one who made it easier for him. Alderman finished reading. The room began to decompress, people reaching for jackets and exchanging murmurs. And then Preston Drury was beside her, appearing at her shoulder, with the ease of a man who had planned his route through the room in advance. He was smiling in the wide, uncomplicated way of someone delivering good news. Lorena, I know this is a lot to take in, but I think I can make this very simple for you. I know someone who could take the whole thing off your hands by end of week. No paperwork headaches, no back and forth. Let me buy you coffee and explain. Lorena looked at him. She looked at the smile, which was genuine in its construction, but hollow in its purpose, the way certain medications look like food. I'll think about it, she said. She walked out ahead of him into the gray November morning. She sat in her car for 2 minutes before starting the engine. The oak tree dropped a single leaf onto her windshield, and she watched it slide to the edge and disappear. In her mind, very quietly, she was not asking whether she should sell. She was asking why Preston Drury had already arranged a buyer before she had been given the chance to ask a single question. The property was on Kettle Creek Road, 9 miles from town, the last driveway before the county road curved away toward the ridge. Lorena drove out the following morning with the binder of documents Alderman had given her and the ring of keys that came with the estate. She had expected to feel the weight of the place. What she had not expected was to feel watched. The driveway was 2 dirt tracks in a strip of dead grass. The house sat back from the road, white paint gone to gray, one shutter hanging from a single hinge. A cedar tree had grown too close to the east corner of the porch, and its roots had lifted 2 boards. Lorena stood by her car for a moment and looked at the property with the same deliberateness she had learned to bring to first assessments. Not jumping to conclusions, not settling on the obvious reading, just looking until the place had a chance to tell her what it actually was. She looked at the barn first. It was set back behind the house lower than she remembered, with a roof that had settled at one end like a man favoring a bad hip. The structure was dark with age and the door faced away from the road. What she noticed was the path between the house and the barn. The grass on either side had grown tall and undisturbed, but in the center, bending slightly left of true, the ground was pressed down in a pattern that was not old. Someone had walked this path within the past 2 weeks. She filed this away the same way she had filed Preston's early arrival. Not urgency, not alarm, just a fact placed in the correct drawer. The house key worked on the first try. Inside, the cold was denser than outside the particular cold of a place that had stopped being heated. A coffee mug with a cracked handle sat on the kitchen table. A 3-legged stool stood near the back wall, the kind a man uses when he can no longer stand for long periods comfortably. On the windowsill above the sink, 3 small glass bottles held dried herbs, their labels written in a hand that was not Orville's, neater and rounder. Someone else had cared for this kitchen once. Lorena walked through the rooms, slowly touching nothing. A jacket hung on a hook in the small bedroom. She put her hand into the pocket without thinking and found a bent nail and a pinch of dried tobacco. She almost smiled. Orville would keep a nail for years if he thought it still had a use. It was a quality she had always found both admirable and difficult, the refusal to let go of anything that retained even a theoretical purpose. She went to the back door, opened it, and looked toward the barn. The path she had seen from the driveway was clearer from here, and now she saw something else. The padlock on the barn door was new. Chrome bright, not a trace of rust, completely wrong against the blackened wood of the doorframe. Orville had been gone for 3 weeks. The estate had been sealed. No one had been authorized to enter the property. Someone had replaced this lock. Lorena stood on the back step for a long moment. Then she went to the key ring and tried the smaller keys one at a time, until one of them, a plain brass key she did not recognize from any description, turned cleanly in the new padlock. She went inside. The barn was cold and dim, smelling of beeswax and old wood, and something underneath, both a mineral stillness, like the inside of a stone wall. Along the left side, a row of beehive boxes sat in various states of disrepair, their wood gone nearly black. Shelves held mason jars with clouded glass, a tin of nails, a hand smoker with a leather bellows stiffened by age, a coil of wire. Everything read as junk. Everything said nothing here worth your time. Lorena had been a nurse. She had walked into rooms that announced themselves as fine and found people who were not. She stood in the center of the barn and let her eyes adjust completely before she moved. The light came in through 2 gaps in the roof and one broken slat in the east wall, falling in bars that picked up the dust disturbed by her entrance. Slowly, the space organized itself into what it was and what it was not. The beehive boxes were arranged in 2 rows along the left wall, largest at the back, smallest at the front. She walked the length of the row, not touching, looking at the spacing between each one, the way you look at a row of objects to see if one of them has been recently disturbed. Everything in this barn had a layer of undisturbed dust, except for 2 things: the floor directly in front of the back boxes and the boxes themselves. The 2 largest boxes at the very back were positioned slightly different from the rest, their bases sitting in a way that did not quite match the dust pattern on the floor around them. Someone had moved them and replaced them. Recently. Behind them, draped as a piece of burlap sacking so old it had nearly merged with the floor, was a wooden chest. Lorena crouched and lifted the edge of the burlap. The chest was made of dense, dark wood dovetail corners. No lock, a simple wooden bar fitted through 2 iron staples as a latch. On its lid, in the thick layer of fine dust that covered everything else, there was a rectangle of clear wood. Not wiped clean with a cloth, pressed clean by a hand placed flat against the surface, large enough to be a man's hand. The dust around it was undisturbed. Someone had come to this chest and touched it. They had not opened it, or if they had found nothing that told them what they were looking for. The hand had pressed and lifted. Whatever they expected to feel through the lid, they had not found it. Lorena lifted the bar and opened the lid. She found 3 notebooks of different sizes, each wrapped in newspaper. The newspaper was old, the ink faded to brown at the edges. She unwrapped them carefully, setting the paper aside without tearing it, laying each notebook flat on the floor beside the chest. The first notebook was mid-size lined paper, the cover worn to softness at the corners. She opened it and read the first page. Orville's handwriting was angular and consistent, the handwriting of a man who had never valued elegance, but had valued accuracy. What she found was a list. Names, dates, items: Agnes Klein, $47, 3 workdays, September. Nadine Holston, $30, 2 quarts, Sourwood Honey March. Clyde Mabry frames, 3 days, no pay accepted. Nola Fitch, 1 quart clover, honey dried mint, small contribution note beside it in smaller script, brought the last of her sourwood. Said it was nothing. It wasn't nothing. Beside many entries, brief notations. Bad knees came anyway. Wouldn't take money back. Stubborn, good, won't ask for help. Bring medicine without asking. 1 entry for a man named George Pedlow, can't come anymore. Still counts. And on the 3rd page, underlined once without explanation, this is a share, not a favor. There is a difference. Lorena read that line and then sat back on her heels. The wood of the barn floor was cold through her jeans. The burlap smell was in her lungs. She did not move for a while. She had taken care of Nola Fitch for 3 years at the Harlan County Clinic. 82 years old now, living alone in a house with a heating system that needed replacing and a refrigerator that ran too warm. Nola had high blood pressure and a fixed income, and the particular pride of a woman who had been independent for so long that accepting help felt like defeat. Every time Lorena had offered to connect her with county assistance programs, Nola had straightened in the examination chair and said she was managing fine. An Orville cantankerous and silent Orville, who could not say thank you without it sounding like an accusation, had written beside her name, "It wasn't nothing." Lorena placed the notebook on her knee and let herself feel what she felt for a moment. Not grief exactly, something older and more complicated. The recognition that you have fundamentally misunderstood someone for a long time, and that the misunderstanding was at least in part because they never made it easy to understand them correctly. Orville had been a difficult man to be around. He had also been apparently a man who paid closer attention to the people around him than any of them had ever known. When she was ready, she continued reading. At the back of the first notebook, tucked inside the rear cover, was a folded piece of paper. Orville's handwriting less careful than the lists written quickly. Agnes Klein has a receipt. She'll know what to do. Lorena folded the paper again, placed it precisely back where she had found it, and replaced the notebook in the chest. She took nothing with her yet. She was not yet sure who might be watching to see what she carried out. When she emerged from the barn into the gray light of the afternoon, the path between the house and the back fence was empty. She walked to the house, sat at Orville's kitchen table, and opened her own notebook. This was an ordinary spiral notebook, the kind she had used through 4 decades of nursing to track what she observed. She had never stopped carrying one, even after retirement, because the habit of recording was by then inseparable from the habit of paying attention. She wrote 4 lines. New lock on barn, no authorization. Handprint on chest, recent. Preston arrived 20 minutes before the reading. Roe watched the barn, not the house. She closed the notebook and set it in her handbag. The phone rang at 7 that evening. Unknown number. She answered it. Lorena. The voice was Patrice Beale Warren's wife, sweet in the way of things that cause cavities. I just wanted to check on you. We're all a little worried you being out there on your own. That property has such a history, things Orville never really talked about. Sometimes it's better not to dig too far back. The warning was light as powder and absolutely clear. Lorena looked out this kitchen window at the place where the barn sat in the dark. She could not see it from here, just the dark outline of the yard, but she knew where it was. She always knew where the things that mattered were. Thank you for calling, Patrice, she said. She hung up. She opened her notebook. Under the 4 lines already written, she added a 5th. Patrice called. They know I went into the barn. The next morning came in cold and colorless. Lorena was back at the property by 7, but she did not go directly to the barn. She made a small fire in Orville's kitchen wood stove, which took 2 attempts and a great deal of patience, and she boiled water on his old range and made coffee in the single cup pour-over she had brought from home. She sat at his table and drank it slowly, looking out the window at the yard. The frost had hardened overnight and the grass stood stiff in the early light. A crow crossed the yard from the fence line to the cedar tree and back again, working something out in the way crows do. She was still sitting there when she heard a vehicle on the drive. 2 doors, 2 sets of footsteps on the gravel. She recognized Preston's walk from the sound before she saw him, unhurried and slightly too large for the space it occupied. The man beside him was new. He was 55, approximately broad, through the shoulders, wearing a coat that belonged in a city and shoes that did not belong on a gravel drive in rural Kentucky in November. He carried himself with the flat confidence of a man who believed that problems were solved by applying sufficient pressure to the correct location. He had not introduced himself yet, and already Lorena found him familiar. She had met this type of man in administrative meetings, in insurance disputes, in the rooms where hospital decisions got made. She had learned that the best response to this type of man was to ask the one question they had not prepared an answer for. Preston knocked and she let them in. The kitchen was warm from the stove. She offered nothing. Preston smiled broadly and pulled out a chair without being invited. The other man remained standing near the door, looking around the kitchen with a professional calm that was really a professional appraisal. Lorena, I want you to meet Clifton Rowe, Preston said. He's been looking at some properties in the county, doing some development work in the region. He's a good man, and I think you two can find a real simple path forward here. Clifton Rowe nodded. He looked around the kitchen, took in the old stove, the cracked window frame, the general air of a house that had been used hard for a long time. His gaze moved briefly to the window that faced the backyard, where the barn was visible in the gray morning light. Then it came back to Lorena. Mrs. Castle, he said, I understand this may be a difficult situation. A property in this condition on your own, the upkeep costs. Preston produced a piece of paper from his jacket and placed it on the table. The number at the bottom was $47,000. For the house, the 4 acres, the outbuildings, everything included. Lorena looked at the number. She looked at the paper, then she looked at Clifton Rowe. "Mr. Rowe," she said, "how long have you been planning to make this offer?" He paused, not long, barely a second, but she had spent 38 years listening to pauses. A pause of that length at that point in a conversation meant the prepared answer had been located and was being retrieved. It was not the pause of a man thinking. It was the pause of a man selecting. Preston laughed just slightly too loud. Lorena Clifton has been keeping an eye on properties in the area for a while. There's nothing unusual about that. It's just good business planning, and the timing here is really favorable for you. I haven't decided anything, Lorena said. Of course not. Preston's smile held. But these windows don't stay open long. When they stood to go, Rowe moved toward the back door first, the one that faced the yard, before catching himself and redirecting toward the front. In the moment before he corrected, he looked through the window at the barn, not a casual glance. A specific look, the kind that belongs to someone checking the location of a known object. It was the third time he had looked at the barn since entering the kitchen. Not at the house, not at the acreage. The barn. Lorena watched them cross the gravel and get into the vehicle. She watched the truck back out and take the driveway at a pace just slightly too casual for men who had not gotten what they came for. When they were out of sight, she stood at the kitchen window for another full minute looking at the barn. She opened her notebook and wrote, Rowe looked at the barn 3 times. Not the land, not the house. The barn. Then she put on her coat and walked across the yard to Agnes Klein's place. Agnes's property was separated from Orville's by a fence line and a quarter-mile of field. The house was small and practical, with a front porch that held a pair of rubber boots, a bushel basket of dried field corn, and a hand-lettered wooden sign that read, "Trespassers will be composted." Lorena had always liked Agnes from the years she had treated Agnes's husband at the clinic before he passed, but she had not known how much until this moment, standing at the gate and watching the old woman come down the porch steps with the directness of someone who had been waiting. Agnes was 71 and built for endurance. She had the eyes of a woman who had seen enough foolishness that she no longer needed to identify its source to recognize its smell. She wore a canvas work coat with a torn pocket she had sewn shut with different colored thread rather than matching it, the repair made by someone who valued function over appearance. "I heard Preston Drury was out here yesterday morning," Agnes said, before Lorena had finished opening the gate. "You didn't sign anything." "No," Agnes exhaled with the relief of someone who has been holding their breath without knowing it. She held the door open and stood aside. The kitchen was warm, cleaner than Orville's, and smelled of dried herbs and coffee. A string of dried hot peppers hung above the window. Agnes poured without asking and sat across the table looking at Lorena with the directness of someone who had decided the situation warranted it. "Orville told me," she said it twice, maybe 3 times in the last year. "He said if anything happened to him, whoever ended up with the house needed to look in that barn before they did a single other thing. Last time he said it was 3 weeks before he went into the hospital. He drove over here himself, which he almost never did for just talking, and he stood at my kitchen door and said it one more time like he wanted to make sure it was in the right place." She paused. "I didn't know it would be you who'd be coming." "Did you know about the others?" "Some of them." Agnes got up and opened the small drawer beside the sink. She took out an envelope, plain white, unsealed. From inside, she removed a piece of lined paper folded in thirds. She placed it flat on the table. It was a receipt, school notebook paper, Orville's handwriting formal in the way he made everything formal when it mattered. Agnes May Klein, $47 and 3 days labor, September, toward the Kettle Creek Apiary Collective. At the bottom, his signature, ungraceful and unmistakable. "He said it wasn't charity," Agnes said quietly. "He got very particular about that. Said if I was going to participate, it was going to be recorded properly. Said he didn't want anybody's contribution disappearing into the idea that he'd done them a favor. I told him I knew that. He said he wanted to make sure." Then Agnes told her about Warren Beale. The week after Orville's funeral, Warren had come to Agnes's door. Pleasant, concerned, certain. He had suggested that if Agnes was holding anything belonging to the estate, she ought to turn it over to the family for safekeeping. It would just be simpler, less complicated for everyone. Agnes had told him that she was not holding anything belonging to the estate, which was true, because what she held belonged to her. Then she had closed the door. Warren had stood on the porch for another minute. Agnes could hear him deciding whether to knock again. He didn't. "That's the thing about men like Warren," Agnes said. They only push when they think the door might open. The moment they feel it's not going to, they find somewhere else to be. Lorena finished her coffee and stood up. I need to find the others, she said. Nadine Holston, Agnes said immediately. She'll have a receipt too. She's the one you should go to first. Agnes picked up the phone and called Nadine Holston, while Lorena was still putting on her coat. Nadine answered on the second ring. Lorena walked back to Orville's house through the field. The frost-stiff grass bending under her boots, the cold coming down more firmly now from the ridge. She stood at the back step and looked at the barn for a moment before going inside. Something had clarified in the past hour. Not everything, not nearly everything, but enough. Orville had not left her a piece of neglected land. He had not left her a burden or a charity project or a problem to be signed away. He had left her something he had spent years building quietly in exactly the way a man like Orville built things without announcement, without any interest in being credited, and with a precision that only made itself legible to someone who was willing to look carefully enough. The notebooks were not the ramblings of an old man with a filing habit. They were a structure. The receipts were not sentiment. They were architecture. She went inside and added one more line to her notebook below all the others. He knew exactly what he was leaving, and he knew exactly who he was leaving it to. The phone rang at 9 that evening. She did not recognize the number, but she answered it. Lorena. Patrice Beale's voice again, still sweet, sweeter now. The sweetness that means the actual message is something else entirely. I just want you to know that we're all a little worried. You being out there alone with all that old property. That barn, especially. Orville kept things to himself. Some of it's better left that way. Lorena looked through the kitchen window at the dark yard. The barn was invisible in the night, but she knew exactly where it was. Thank you for calling, Patrice, she said, the same as before. She hung up. She wrote in her notebook. Patrice called again. Second warning in 2 days. They are not waiting to see what I'll do. They are trying to decide for me before I have the chance. She closed the notebook and sat with both hands flat on the table. Outside, a car moved slowly along Kettle Creek Road without stopping. She heard the engine ease past unhurried, and then the silence of the Kentucky night came back. She thought about Orville working alone in that barn for years, writing names in a notebook, keeping receipts, saying this is a share, not a favor, to people who probably thought he was being difficult when actually he was being precise. They had come to this property before she had unpacked a single box. They had already arranged a buyer, already set a price, already tested the door. They had been so certain she would not look inside the chest. So certain she was the kind of woman who accepted what she was handed and signed where she was told. Lorena Castle sat at Orville's kitchen table in the dark and was, for the first time since the reading, not grieving and not uncertain and not afraid. She was paying attention. And that, as it turned out, was exactly what Orville had needed her to do. Nadine Holston arrived at Agnes Klein's kitchen in 19 minutes, which was faster than Lorena had expected from a 68-year-old woman who lived on the far side of the county road. She came through the back door without knocking, the way people do in houses where they have been welcomed so many times the formality has worn away, and she was already pulling something from the inside pocket of her coat before she had fully removed it. The receipt was folded into quarters, the paper soft at the creases from being open and refolded many times over the years. Orville's handwriting, the same format as Agnes's, the same careful recording of name and date and contribution. Nadine Holston, $30, 2 quarts sourwood honey. The bottom line the same, his signature, and the word share written beside it in a hand slightly different from the rest, added later, as if he had gone back to make sure the word was there. Nadine sat down across from Lorena without being invited, which told Lorena something about the kind of woman she was dealing with. Preston Drury told my son last week that the sale was already settled, Nadine said. That you had agreed. My son came home and told me to stop bothering with Orville's old business. She set the receipt on the table between them. I didn't say a word to my son, but I kept this. Lorena looked at the receipt and then at Nadine's face. There was something in Nadine's expression that Lorena recognized from the examination room, the look of a person who has been disbelieved enough times that they carry their evidence with them before anyone asks for it. When exactly did Preston speak to your son? Thursday, 6 days ago. 6 days ago was 4 days before the estate reading. 4 days before Lorena had been told anything at all about what she was inheriting. Agnes poured coffee for Nadine without being asked. The 3 women sat at the small table with the receipts between them, and Lorena felt the shape of what she was dealing with come into clearer focus. Preston had not begun working after the reading. He had been working for weeks before it. He had spoken to Nadine's son, sent Celia to Agnes's door, arranged Clifton Rowe, prepared the offer document, and been sitting in that lawyer's office 20 minutes early. The whole structure had been built in advance. All it had needed was Lorena's signature. Nadine put both hands around her coffee cup. "There's something else," she said. "Clifton Rowe, I know who he is. My nephew works county permits. Rowe's company, it's called Ridgeline Development Group. They filed a preliminary survey request for the East Valley Corridor 8 weeks ago, 6 weeks before Orville died." The kitchen was very quiet. "They were here before Orville passed," Agnes said. "They were here before Orville was even in the hospital," Nadine said. Lorena did not write anything down. She sat with this new information the way she had learned to sit with difficult diagnoses, letting it settle into its proper place before deciding what it meant for the next step. Then she picked up the smaller of the two receipts, Nadine's, and held it carefully by the edge. "I need to go see Wendell Adcox," she said. Wendell Adcox's office occupied the ground floor of a 2-story brick building on Main Street that had been a hardware store before it was a law office, and before that, according to the sign painted faintly on the upper brick, a dry goods concern. The front room smelled of paper and the particular kind of order that belongs to people who have spent decades managing other people's complicated situations and have learned that neatness is the only armor that holds. Wendell was 58 with gray at his temples and reading glasses pushed up on his forehead. He was the kind of man who listened with his whole face, not performing attention, but actually in it. He had a quality Lorena associated with the best kind of stillness, the kind that was not passivity, but patience. The kind that made other people feel they had been given enough space to say the true thing instead of the easy one. He let her finish before he said anything. He read through the copies of the notebook pages she had brought, the 2 receipts, and then read them again. He turned back to one specific page, the one with Nola Fitch's entry, and paused on it longer than the others. "These are not executed legal documents," he said finally. Lorena felt the floor drop slightly. "But they're not nothing either." Wendell continued, setting the papers down with the careful flatness of someone placing something valuable on a surface. "Those are 2 different things, and I want to be precise about it because it matters." He explained it once clearly, and she listened to every word. The notebooks and receipts, taken together with living witnesses who could confirm participation, created the basis for what was called an equitable contribution claim. It was not a guaranteed outcome. It did not automatically block anything. But properly filed and properly supported, it was sufficient grounds to place a legal hold on any property transaction until the claims had been fully examined. Preston could not complete a sale with that hold in place. Not cleanly, not quickly. And Clifton Rowe, from what Nadine had said, was a man who needed things to happen quickly. "Orville came to see me," Wendell said, and his voice shifted slightly, the way a voice shifts when it moves from professional to personal. 11 months ago, he wanted to formalize the community arrangement properly. The whole thing, all the participants, proper filings. He set down his pen. I told him exactly what he needed. Signed in participation agreements, a formal trust structure, the right sequence of filings with the county. He listened to everything. He said he'd come back when he had what was needed. Wendell was quiet for a moment. He never came back. Lorena looked at the window. A pickup truck moved slowly past on Main Street. "He left it to you," Wendell said, "because he told me in those words that you were the kind of person who wouldn't sign the first paper someone put in front of you." He said it like it was a fact he had verified. She drove back to Kettle Creek Road in the early afternoon. The notebook copies on the passenger seat, Wendell's card in her coat pocket. The sky had changed from gray to the particular white that comes before the first serious cold of the season. Orville had come to Wendell 11 months ago. He had known a full year before he died that the arrangement needed legal structure. And then something had stopped him from completing it, whether illness or stubbornness, or the particular paralysis of a man who trusted action more than process. But he had left the notebooks. He had kept every receipt. And he had left the property to the one person in his life he believed would not be talked out of looking. She was almost to the front door when she heard the sound of tires on gravel. Warren Beale's truck came up the drive at a moderate speed, not hurrying, not hesitating, with the confidence of a man who had decided his visit was entirely reasonable. He parked and got out and walked toward her with his hands at his sides, no folder, no documents, just himself and the certainty he carried as a matter of habit. Lorena, he stopped at the foot of the porch steps looking up at her with an expression that wanted to be mistaken for concern. I heard you've been going around to people, Agnes Klein, the Holston woman, stirring things up. I've been talking to neighbors, she said, with photocopies of Orville's old notebooks. Warren's tone shifted just slightly, moving from concern toward instruction. Those people gave Orville some jars of honey and some yard work over the years. That doesn't make them stakeholders, Lorena. That makes them neighbors who did favors. There's a difference between sentiment and a legal claim. She had heard the phrase before, not from Warren, from a hospital administrator 15 years ago explaining why the long-term care ward was being restructured in a way that would affect 14 elderly patients who had nowhere else to go. Sentiment and practical necessity. The administrator had been certain he was being reasonable. He had used that certainty as a kind of permission. Warren, Lorena said, in 38 years of nursing, I watched a lot of people decide what someone else's contribution was worth from the other side of the room. They were wrong every single time. Warren looked at her for a moment without speaking. He was a man built for having the last word, and the absence of it visibly unsettled him. He nodded once, something that was not agreement, and walked back to his truck. Lorena watched him go and noted the way he did not look at the barn as he left, which was its own kind of information. A man who knows what is in a place does not look at it when he wants to appear indifferent. She went inside and straight through the house to the back door, and what she saw made her stop. The barn door was ajar, not open, not broken in, just ajar by 4 inches the way a door looks when someone has pulled it closed from the inside and the latch did not quite catch. She had locked it that morning. She remembered the particular resistance of the padlock, the way the shackle had required firm pressure to seat properly. She walked the path without running, pushed the door open fully, and stood in the entrance. Everything appeared to be in its place. The hive boxes along the left wall, the shelves, the equipment. She went to the back and moved the 2 largest boxes. The chest was there, lid closed, bar in the latch. But the burlap sacking that had covered it was folded differently than she had left it. She had folded it loosely over the chest when she replaced it that first day. Now it was folded back on itself, corner to corner, the way someone folds a cloth when they are being careful about not leaving evidence. Someone had been in the barn. Someone had found the chest and opened it. Warren's arrival on her porch had not been coincidence. It had been a door being tested while another door was being searched. She carried the notebooks into the house and placed them under the loose board beneath Orville's kitchen sink, the one that lifted away from the floor joist without tools. She had found it by accident 2 days ago, a hiding space so unremarkable that it looked like ordinary disrepair. Then she sat at the kitchen table and wrote for 10 minutes straight everything she had learned since morning. The following Sunday, Lorena drove to the First Baptist Church on Millway Road, where she knew several of the names from Orville's notebooks attended services. She was not there for the service. She arrived early and stood near the side door with a folder of copied pages, intending to speak with people as they came out. Patrice Beale was already there. Lorena did not see her at first. She heard that particular voice modulated to sound concerned, spreading information through a social space, the way smoke moves through a building, finding every opening. Patrice was speaking with 2 older women near the far side of the parking lot, and even from a distance, Lorena could read the posture of the conversation. One of the women was pulling away slightly, the other had her arms crossed. Lorena moved closer. It's just that when someone starts collecting names and building a legal case, Patrice was saying, it puts everyone in an uncomfortable position. Nobody wants to be dragged into a lawsuit over a few jars of honey from 20 years ago. One of the women looked up and saw Lorena. Patrice turned. For a moment, the 3 of them stood in the cold parking lot with the church bell still fading in the air. Lorena, Patrice said, shifting immediately to warmth the way a thermostat responds to a door opening. We were just talking about you. I know, Lorena said. She looked at the 2 older women, both of whom she recognized from Orville's notebooks. One of them, a woman named Vera Comstock, had her jaw set in the way of someone who has just been given a reason to be afraid of something they were previously willing to do. The other, Mildred Puckett, looked between Lorena and Patrice with the exhaustion of someone watching an argument they did not start. I'm not building a legal case against anyone, Lorena said to them, not to Patrice. Orville kept records of people who participated in his apiary project over the years. I'm trying to make sure those records are honored the way he intended. That's all. Vera Comstock said nothing. She looked at her shoes. Then she looked at Patrice. Then she walked back toward the church entrance. Mildred Puckett stayed where she was. I have a receipt, Mildred said quietly. Orville gave it to me 8 years ago. I didn't know anyone else had one. Lorena wrote down Mildred's address and said she would come by that afternoon. Patrice said nothing through any of this. She stood with her arms folded, and when Lorena turned to go, she said, "You're making this harder than it needs to be." Lorena looked at her. "No," she said. "Someone else did that." She walked back to her car. Behind her, she heard Patrice begin talking again to whoever was still listening. The afternoon after her confrontation with Patrice at the church, Lorena drove to Mildred Puckett's house on the far side of the county, a small white frame house with a garden that had been put to bed for winter, the beds mulched and the rose canes tied. Mildred answered the door in her housecoat and looked at Lorena for a long moment before stepping aside. The receipt was in the kitchen drawer in a plain envelope with nothing written on the outside. Mildred had tucked it under a stack of Christmas cards and a notepad and a rubber band collection, the way a person stores something they are not ready to throw away, but are not sure they have any use for. "I kept it because I wasn't sure what else to do with it," Mildred said. "Orville was always very particular about things being in the right place. I figured if he wrote a receipt, he had a reason, and I didn't want to be the one who lost it." Her contribution had been dried chamomile and 3 afternoons helping sort the fall harvest. Orville had written beside her name thorough. Good eye for quality. Lorena read those words and thought about what it cost to say a thing like that, how much it cost Orville to write a compliment about anyone, and how he had written them anyway in his small, angular hand for more than 20 years. 12 people I know of kept theirs, Mildred said. There might be more who don't know it matters. "That's why I'm here," Lorena said. She drove back to Kettle Creek Road in the late afternoon with the receipt beside her, on the seat the November light going flat over the ridgeline. She thought about all the kitchen drawers in all the houses in this county, the ones holding paper that had been waiting a long time for someone to ask after it. Night came down fast in November in the hills. By 5 o'clock, the ridgeline was gone into dark. Lorena built up the stove-made dinner from what she had brought and read through the second notebook at the kitchen table with the lamp pulled close. This one was older, its pages more brittle. It held records of herb harvests, lists of what had been dried, and stored calculations for how much honey a healthy hive produced in a good season versus a poor one, and names again, different names, some overlapping with the first book, some new. She was on the 4th page when she found the name that made her set down her coffee. Patrice Beale. 5 years ago, a single entry. $22 one afternoon of work sorting frames. Orville's notation beside it was different from his others. Not about the contribution itself. Just 3 words told by Warren. She read it twice. Patrice had participated, and Orville had noted that she had come at Warren's direction, not of her own accord. It meant that Warren Beale had at some point 5 years ago sent his wife to involve herself in exactly the thing he was now calling sentimental foolishness. Lorena set the notebook down and looked at the dark window. The 3rd notebook was the smallest, its cover worn to the texture of old cloth. She opened it carefully, angling the lamp. Most of it was practical. Then near the middle, she found 2 pages written in darker ink, more deliberate, as if Orville had been composing something he intended to matter. Preston Drury had been to the property 3 times in the year before Orville's death, always to talk about the back acreage, always circling toward the question of whether Orville had considered selling. Each time Orville had said no. On the 3rd visit, Preston had smiled at the refusal and said not yet. Orville had underlined not yet. 3 pages further in the darker ink. The back acreage holds the water table access for the entire east side of the valley. The spring rights are filed under my name separately with the county. They transfer with the land unless explicitly retained. Preston does not know I know this. I believe he has been waiting for me to, without making that retention explicit. Lorena read this passage standing up, which she had not realized she had done until she was already on her feet. It was not about the barn. It was not about the $47,000. The barn, the notebooks, the community arrangement Orville had spent years building, all of it had been sitting on top of something else entirely. Water rights, spring access rights, filed separately with the county attached to the property unless actively protected. In a development company that had begun its survey work 6 weeks before Orville's death because someone had told them the rights would be available soon. She sat back down and wrote 1 line in her notebook. This is why they needed her to sign before she had time to read. She was still at the table at 11 o'clock, and the house had gone cold at the edges when she heard the sound outside. Footsteps on cold earth, careful and irregular, moving from the far side of the yard toward the barn. Then a thin bar of light, a flashlight, moving past the kitchen window. Lorena sat at the table with her hands flat, watching the light trace slowly past the glass. Her heart rate had increased, which she noted as a fact without letting it make decisions for her. She had worked night shifts for 15 years. She knew what it felt like to be the only person awake in a building where something was wrong, and she knew that the way you responded in the first 30 seconds determined everything that came after. She picked up her phone and called Agnes Klein. Agnes answered on the second ring. "Someone's in my yard," Lorena said, "moving toward the barn. I need you here." 8 minutes, Agnes said, and the line went dead. It was actually 6. Agnes's truck came up the drive without lights until it was through the gate, and then the headlights came on, full flooding the yard. Lorena heard Agnes's door open and then Agnes's voice, which was not a quiet voice under any circumstances and was particularly not quiet at that moment. "This is private property, and I have a shotgun and no patience for either of you." The flashlight went out. Lorena heard someone moving fast through the dead grass along the far fence line, and then the sound of a vehicle engine starting from somewhere down the county road too far away to have been parked at the drive. A second vehicle door, a pause, and then tires on gravel accelerating. Agnes came to the back door and knocked twice before opening it. "There were 2 of them," she said, pulling off her gloves. "Second one was by the fence. I heard him go over the wire." "Did you actually bring a shotgun?" Agnes looked at her steadily. "I brought my keys and my good voice." "Sit down, Raina, you've gone pale." Lorena made coffee because there was nothing better to do with her hands. Agnes sat across from her, and they did not speak for a little while, which was the kind of silence that has content in it rather than absence. "He sent someone," Lorena said finally. "Preston, he's not coming himself anymore." "No," Agnes agreed. "He's getting to the end of what he can control quietly, and the next thing after quiet is not quiet." Lorena looked at the dark window. "I found something in the third notebook," she said. "It isn't just about the community arrangement." She told Agnes about the water rights, about Ridgeline Development Group and the survey filed 6 weeks before Orville's death, about not yet underlined, about the fact that Preston had been watching this property for years and that Clifton Rowe had arrived so quickly after the reading because someone had already told him the window was open. Agnes listened without interrupting. When Lorena finished, she sat for a moment. "Orville knew all of this," Agnes said. "He wrote it down. Why didn't he just file the retention himself and be done with it?" Lorena thought about the man who had come to Wendell Adcock's 11 months ago and gotten the information he needed and then had not come back. She thought about the bent nail in the jacket pocket. "I think he was building something," she said. "Not just protecting something. He wanted the community arrangement formalized at the same time so the water rights and the people's contributions would be protected together as one thing. He didn't want to file the retention and leave the notebooks vulnerable. He wanted to do it right." She paused. "He ran out of time." Agnes was quiet for a moment. "So he left it to you?" "He left it to me." They sat with that. The stove ticked as it cooled. "You need to go to Wendell Adcock's tomorrow morning," Agnes said. "With the third notebook. With everything. And you need to bring Clyde Mabry into this." Lorena looked at her. Clyde Mabry was in the first notebook. 3 days of framework, refused payment. "He's the one Preston will not have thought to go to," Agnes said. "That's always been Preston's problem. He underestimates the people who don't dress well." Outside the kitchen window, the dark held the yard and the barn and the November cold. Lorena looked at it and thought about the water table running beneath 4 acres of old land, invisible and essential, the kind of thing that had value precisely because most people did not know it was there. She opened her notebook and wrote the last thing she would write that night. "They came for the barn tonight. They found nothing. Tomorrow we go to Wendell with everything, and then we find the people whose names Orville wrote down, and we do this the way he would have wanted it done. The right way. Together." She looked at what she had written. Then she looked at Agnes, who was refilling her own coffee with the calm of a woman who had already decided she was staying the night. The morning came in clear for the first time in 2 weeks, a hard blue sky over the ridge with no cloud in it, and the cold had the quality of something that had finally decided to be honest about itself. Lorena was on the road before 7, the 3 notebooks wrapped in a clean dish towel and placed in the bottom of her bag, Wendell's copies in a separate folder. Agnes followed in her own truck. They did not discuss it. Agnes had simply been standing at her own gate when Lorena came down the drive, coat on, keys in hand. Wendell Adcox's office was not yet open when they arrived, but Wendell was already inside. He let them in without comment, turned on the overhead light, and put coffee on before he looked at what Lorena had brought. He read through the third notebook in full silence. When he reached the passage about the water rights, about the county, filing, and the transfer clause, he took his glasses off, set them on the desk, and rubbed the bridge of his nose once. Then he put them back on and kept reading. Orville filed the spring rights in his name alone in 2015, Wendell said when he finished. I can pull the county record today. If the retention language he used in that filing is what I think it is, those rights do not automatically transfer with the land. But they are also not automatically protected in a standard estate sale if the buyer's attorney is looking to absorb them quietly. He set the notebook down. The offer document Preston produced for you contained no mention of water rights whatsoever. I know, Lorena said. That is not an oversight. Wendell looked at her directly. That is a document designed to be signed by someone who did not know to look for what was missing. Agnes had been standing near the window. She turned around. Can you hold the sale? With the contribution claims and the water rights question both in filing, yes. Nothing closes until both are resolved. Wendell was already pulling forms from his drawer. I need to know how many people from those notebooks are willing to come forward. Lorena had spent the previous night going through both lists. She gave Wendell 14 names. Some she had already spoken to. Others she had located through Agnes and Nadine, through the quiet network of people who had known Orville and understood once she explained what was being asked of them. Today, she said, I want to bring them today. Wendell looked at his calendar, then at her face. He moved 2 appointments. Before Wendell opened the office to others, Lorena went to find Clyde Mabry. His house was north of the county road, set back from a dirt track with a garage larger than the house, and the smell of sawdust coming from it even in November. He had opened the door before she knocked, which meant he had heard her car. Clyde was 74 with large hands and the unhurried movements of a man who had learned that things done correctly the first time did not need to be done again. He did not say much when she explained. He read the notebook entry with his name in it, the 3 days of framework, and the refused payment, and set the page down on his workbench without speaking. He never told me he wrote it down, Clyde said after a moment. He wrote everything down. Clyde was quiet for a moment longer. Then he put down the sanding block he had been holding and looked at her directly. Preston Drury came to see me 2 weeks ago, Clyde said. Before the reading, said he was checking in on old friends of the family, said he figured I'd be glad the property was going to be taken care of properly. I told him I didn't know Orville's business and he could mind his own. Clyde picked up the sanding block again. He looked at me like I was something he'd stepped over. Lorena thought about what Agnes had said. Preston underestimates the people who don't dress well. Then Clyde walked to the back of the garage and came back carrying a wooden box, old but solid, built from the same dense dark wood as the chest in the barn. Inside were 4 honeycomb frames, finished by hand, their joints fitted without gaps, the wood smoothed to a consistency that took patience and care to achieve. The work of someone who had spent a winter doing one thing correctly. I made these for Orville, Clyde said. Last spring, he was getting too stiff to work the frames himself, and I told him I'd build him a new set. He died before I could bring them over. He closed the box. I figured someone ought to finish what he started. They came through this morning in 1s and 2s, some together, some alone. Nola Fitch arrived in her good coat, the one she wore to church, buttoned to the top button, despite the warmth of the office. She was 82 and moved carefully, but she sat down across from Wendell and answered every question he asked with the precision of a woman who had kept her own records of her own life for 8 decades. When Wendell turned the copied notebook page to her entry and she saw her name in Orville's handwriting, she placed one hand flat on the page without speaking. She left it there for a long moment. Then she answered the next question. Nadine arrived with 2 women. Lorena did not know both of them with their own receipts. Both of them having held those receipts through years of not being sure anyone would ever ask to see them. A woman named. The gathering at Wendell's office had a quality Lorena would think about for years afterward. Not its drama, which was modest, but its ordinariness. These were not people who had been waiting for a victory. They were people who had come because they had been asked, and because what they had been asked to do was simply to say what was true. The receipts were true. The work they had done was true. Orville's notebooks were true. They had not needed a lawyer to make any of that true. They only needed a lawyer to make sure it could not be unmade. Harriet Soames sat near the window with her hands in her lap and watched each person arrive. When Lorena called her name from the list, she stood and gave a clear account of the 3 seasons she had mended hive covers, the materials she had contributed, and the date of each. She sat back down without embellishment. She did not look at Preston Drury when he came in. She did not look away from him either. She simply did not regard him as relevant to what she was there to do. George Pedlow's son, whose name was Franklin, stayed after the main proceedings were finished and helped Wendell stack the copies into folders. He did not volunteer his reason. When Lorena thanked him for coming, he said his father had talked about Orville's project once, years ago, called it the only idea anyone around here had ever had that made any sense, and then gone back to watching the television. Franklin had not thought about it again until the receipt turned up in the coffee can. He didn't say much about what mattered to him, Franklin said, but he kept the paper. I guess that's the same thing. Lorena thought it was. She thought it was exactly the same thing. Harriet Soames, 73, came with her neighbor. Harriet had mended hive covers for 3 seasons' work that Orville had recorded with the same precision he recorded everything. She sat down and smoothed her skirt and waited to give her name. An older man named Alton Frey, 78, came with his adult son. Alton was not in any of the notebooks. He told Lorena he had tried to give Orville money 3 times and Orville had refused each time, told him he had already contributed enough in other ways that Alton could no longer remember. Alton had come anyway. He wanted to be in the room. Wendell did not ask Alton Frey to sign anything. He simply wrote his name at the bottom of a separate page and said, "You're in the record." A man named George Pedlow's son appeared mid-morning carrying a coffee can that rattled when he walked. His father, whose name Lorena had read in the notebook with the notation, "Can't come anymore, still counts," had died 2 years earlier. The son had found the receipt among his father's effects and had kept it without knowing why. He placed the coffee can on Wendell's desk. "Daddy kept his receipts in here," the son said. "All of them his whole life. Orville's was in there with the rest." Wendell set the receipt beside the others and recorded it. The coffee can stayed on the corner of the desk for the rest of the morning, not because anyone asked for it to, but because no one moved it. Mildred Puckett arrived last, still looking between the door and Lorena, as if she had not fully decided until the moment she walked in. She had her receipt in a church envelope unsealed. She sat near the back of the room and said nothing until Wendell called her name, and then she answered clearly and without hesitation. The room had grown warm with bodies and coffee by 10 in the morning. Wendell moved between people steadily, his manner efficient but not cold, the way a man moves when he has a large amount of work to do and has decided that the work matters. He had said almost nothing personal since the morning began. Then he stood at his desk to address the room and said the one thing Lorena had not expected. "My father worked a piece of land in this county for 40 years, Wendell said. The room quieted around him. When he died, there was nothing written down. Every arrangement he had made with every neighbor, every trade, every agreement built on a handshake over 30 years, it all disappeared. Not because anyone stole it, just because it was never recorded, and unrecorded things become invisible." He paused. "I became a notary because of that. Orville Cassell understood what I was trying to do in this office. That is why he came to me 11 months ago. And that is why I am going to make sure that what he built does not become invisible." No one spoke for a moment. Nola Fitch from her chair near the window nodded. Once the nod of a woman who has been waiting a long time for someone to say something true. The door opened. Preston Drury came in with Clifton Rowe behind him, and the room changed temperature in the way rooms do when someone enters who did not expect to find it occupied. Preston's prepared expression, the broad and reasonable smile, met the reality of 14 people sitting in a county notary's office and adjusted imperfectly. Clifton Rowe behind him took in the room in the practiced way of a man who evaluates situations for a living. He saw Wendell's desk covered in documents. He saw Clyde Mabry's wooden box. He saw the faces of people who had not been talked into being somewhere, but had chosen it. Preston recovered first. He was practiced at recovery. "Lorena," he said, friendly and surprised in equal measure, both of them performed. "I didn't know you were meeting here. Clifton and I have an appointment with Mr. Adcox about the property paperwork." Wendell's voice came from the far end of the room, level and carrying. "There is no scheduled appointment at Preston. You're welcome to wait outside or come back this afternoon." Preston's smile did not fall, but something behind it did. "Wendell, we just need a few minutes. This is a straightforward transaction, and Lorena and I have discussed the terms. It's really just a matter of finalizing. We have not discussed any terms, Lorena said. The room was very quiet. Preston looked at her, then at the people around her, then at the papers on Wendell's desk. He was doing mathematics in his head, the kind that has nothing to do with numbers, and the results were not what he had planned for. Clifton Rowe had stopped looking at the room. He was looking at Preston. "You told me this was a clean transaction," Rowe said. His voice was not angry. It was the voice of a man removing himself from a situation before it became attached to him. Willing seller, clear title, no encumbrances. "It is clean, Clifton. These people are just making things unnecessarily complicated. The property belongs to Lorena, and she has every right to sell." "Did you receive consideration before obtaining the owner's written consent to sell?" The question sat in the room. Preston said nothing. That was his answer. Clifton Rowe picked up his folder from under his arm, adjusted his grip on it, and looked at Lorena directly for the first time. "Mrs. Cassell," he said, "I apologize for the confusion on my end." He looked at Preston one more time, the look of a man closing a ledger. "Return my deposit by Friday. I don't move forward with clouded titles, and I don't move forward with misrepresented seller status. We're done here." He walked out. The door closed behind him without drama. The room breathed again. Preston stood in the center of it, and for the first time since Lorena had known him, he looked like a man standing in weather he had not dressed for. He was still present, still in his good jacket, but the architecture of his confidence had shifted in a way that could not be unshifted. He looked at Lorena the way people look at the moment just before they say something they cannot take back. "You have no idea what you're protecting," he said. The pleasantness was gone. What remained was something colder and more honest. These people gave Orville some honey and a few hours in the yard over 20 years. That is not a stake in anything. That is nostalgia. And nostalgia doesn't hold up anywhere that matters. The room was still. Nadine Holston stood up. She was not a large woman. She was 68 years old, and she had been a widow for 9 years, and she had held a piece of lined notebook paper in her kitchen drawer for longer than that. She stood up and she looked at Preston Drury without heat and without apology, the way you look at something you have understood for a long time and have simply been waiting for the right moment to name. "My husband died the year I gave Orville that money," Nadine said. "It was $30. I did not have $30 I could spare. I gave it because Orville looked me in the eye and said it mattered. Not that it would amount to something. Not that I'd see it come back. Just that it mattered." She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. "You have never looked at a single one of us long enough to see anything at all." Preston had no answer for that. He looked around the room for one and found only faces looking back at him, quiet and steady, and already decided. Lorena put her hand flat on the notebook on Wendell's desk. Orville's handwriting visible through the plastic sleeve Wendell had placed it in. All those names, all those entries, all those years of a man recording in his angular and unbeautiful hand that the people around him had shown up and that their showing up had counted. "Preston," she said, "Orville didn't hide these ledgers because he was ashamed of what was in them. He hid them because he knew you would call them nothing. And he didn't want the people who mattered to him to hear that from you." She did not need to say anything after that. Neither did anyone else. Preston Drury picked up his folder, which he had set on the edge of a chair when he came in, and walked to the door. He did not slam it. He closed it quietly, which was in some ways worse, the exit of a man who still believed that composure was the same as dignity. Wendell watched him go. Then he turned back to his desk and continued working. Lorena sat down in the nearest empty chair. She had not realized until that moment how tired her legs were. Clyde Mowbray from across the room said nothing. He just reached over and set his wooden box of frames on the table beside her. Not a gesture that required interpretation. 3 days later, a letter arrived at the property on Kettle Creek Road, addressed to Lorena Castle in the formal letterhead of a company called Ridgeline Development Group with a return address in Lexington. It was not from Preston. Preston's name appeared nowhere in it. The letter was from Clifton Rowe. It was brief and professional and offered to purchase the water rights, only leaving all land and structures with Lorena at a price that was not $47,000 for the whole property, but a specific and separately calculated number for the spring access rights alone. The number was substantial. It was the kind of number that acknowledged the rights had real value. It was, in its way, an apology translated into the only language Clifton Rowe used. She brought the letter to Wendell, who read it and confirmed that selling the water rights separately while retaining the land was legally possible and would require careful structuring to ensure the community land trust was fully protected before any transaction was finalized. "What do you want to do?" Wendell asked. She did not answer immediately. She took the letter home to Carriol Creek Road and sat with it at Orville's kitchen table and spent an evening going through the smallest notebook again. She found the passage about the water rights, and she found 4 pages further, something she had not looked for the first time through. It was a reference to a prior offer, 12 years ago from a different company for the same water rights. Orville had written the amount, which was lower than Rowe's current offer, but still significant, and below the amount, his reason for refusing. "This valley needs this water. The people here need this water. There is no development plan that accounts for what dry wells do to old people on fixed incomes in a place where there is no municipal supply. Not for sale. Not now, not when I'm gone." Lorena read this 3 times. The third time she did it slowly, word by word, as if she were learning it. Orville had known. He had known 12 years ago exactly what the water rights were worth and what selling them would mean for the valley, for the people who lived here, for the wells and fields and old houses that depended on the groundwater the spring fed. He had refused, and he had recorded the refusal and the reasoning in the same precise and uncommented way he recorded everything. She set the notebook down and looked out the window for a long time. She wrote a letter to Clifton Rowe. Wendell helped her with the legal language. The answer was no. The water rights were not for sale. They would be held with the land in trust, and the community trust document that Wendell was preparing would include explicit language, ensuring that any future transfer of the water rights required the consent of the trust participants. Rowe's response came 4 days later. It acknowledged her decision without argument. The development project he wrote would need to find a different quarter. He wished her well. It was the letter of a man who had been in enough negotiations to know when one was genuinely over. She did not hear from Preston again. Wendell handled the formal communications. The deposit returned to Rowe on the Friday as requested. Warren Beale stopped driving past the property on his way to places that were not in that direction. Patrice did not call again. The particular silence of people who have stopped trying was different from the silence that had been in this house when Lorena arrived, and she knew the difference. It was on a Wednesday, 12 days after the meeting in Wendell's office, that Celia Drury came to the door. She came alone in a plain coat without the high posture and controlled expression she had worn at the estate reading. She was carrying a cardboard box, not large, the kind used for storing papers. She stood on the porch and did not pretend the visit was comfortable. "I don't expect anything from this," Celia said. "I just thought you should have it." She held the box out. Lorena took it and stepped back to let her in. Inside the box was a collection of papers from her mother's household, Margaret Drury, who had died 4 years ago. Among the papers were 4 receipts. Not 1. 4. All in Orville's handwriting. All from different years, the earliest dated 18 years ago, the most recent from 6 years before Margaret died. Each one in the same format, same careful recording of what Margaret had contributed, each one with the same word at the bottom beside the signature. Celia sat at the kitchen table without being asked. She did not look around the room or make any remark about the house. She looked at the box as if she were still deciding whether she had done the right thing by bringing it. "She used to drive out here on Saturdays," Celia said. "I thought she was visiting a neighbor. I never asked what she was doing. I never asked her much of anything about her own life after my father died." She paused. "I found these when I was going through her things the second time. The first time I was too busy to go through everything properly." Lorena looked at the 4 receipts, the earliest one on paper, so old it had gone slightly gold at the edges. Margaret Drury had come back year after year without telling anyone in her family. She had given what she had and kept the receipt and said nothing about it and come back again. "Do you think she knew it mattered to him?" Celia said. The question was not rhetorical. She was genuinely asking. Lorena picked up the oldest receipt. Margaret's contribution listed in full clover honey and dried apple slices in 1 day of work in October. Beside the entry, Orville had written 3 words in parentheses. A bracket that was unusual for his format came back again. "She came 4 times over 18 years, Lorena said. "People don't do something 4 times over 18 years unless they know it matters." Celia looked out the kitchen window. Something in her face had loosened in a way that was not comfortable, but was honest the way a thing looks when it has been held tight for a long time and is finally allowed to be its actual shape. "I said something terrible to you at the reading," she said. "Not an apology exactly, a statement of fact." "Yes," Lorena said. "My mother would have been ashamed of me." "Probably," Lorena said. It was not the answer Celia had expected, and it was not a warm one, but it was a true one. And after a moment, Celia made a sound that started as something else and arrived as something close to a laugh, brief and rueful. And for a moment, she looked less like the woman who had said strays and more like someone's daughter who had just learned something important and was not sure what to do with it yet. When Celia left that afternoon, she paused at the gate for a moment and looked back at the property, at the house in the yard and the barn visible behind it. She did not say anything. She just stood there for a moment with her hand on the gate latch, looking at the place her mother had driven to on Saturdays for 18 years without mentioning it to anyone, and then she walked to her car and drove away. Lorena watched her go from the porch. She thought about Margaret Drury, who had never been anything but a background figure in the story of the Drury family, a woman defined almost entirely by her relationship to her husband and then her children. And yet here was the record of her 18 years of Saturdays, 4 receipts, a note in an old man's notebook that said, "Came back again." Margaret Drury had known something her daughter had not, something her son-in-law would never understand, that the small things you do consistently over time are not small. They are the longest things. They outlast the large gestures and the loud claims and the confident predictions about what will matter in the end. The receipts were in Wendell's folder, now recorded and filed. Margaret Drury's name was on the list alongside the others. Whatever she had been in the rest of her life, in this particular record, she was what Orville had seen when he looked at her, steady, reliable, came back again. Lorena added Margaret Drury's name to the community trust record that afternoon, listing all 4 years of contributions, noting each one in the same format Orville had used, and placing the receipts in the archive folder Wendell was building for the formal filing. Margaret Drury's share was not large. It was not intended to be, but it was recorded fully and permanently alongside every other name Orville had written down over 20 years. In the weeks between the meeting at Wendell's office and the first day at the apiary in May, Lorena spent a great deal of time at the property on Kettle Creek Road. She was not idle. The house needed attention, and she gave it attention, working through each room the way she had worked through each year of nursing methodically, without rushing, doing what needed doing, rather than what would look best. She replaced a cracked window pane in the bedroom. She had the chimney swept. She spent 3 days sorting through Orville's personal belongings with the care of someone handling materials that could not be reproduced. In the small bedroom closet, she found a single box, taped shut with her name written on the outside in Orville's handwriting. Inside was a collection of things that had belonged to her husband, Orville's younger brother, who had been dead for 3 years, a pocket watch, a photograph, 2 letters in her own handwriting from very early in their marriage, and a note from Orville that said only, "He asked me to keep these until you were ready. I hope this is the right time." She sat on the edge of the bed and held the pocket watch for a long time. Then she put everything back in the box and set it on the shelf where she could see it from the kitchen door. She was not entirely sure Orville had been right about the timing, but she had learned in the past several weeks that Orville was right about more things than he had ever bothered to say out loud. Clyde Mabry stopped by on a Tuesday evening with a question about the hive placement and stayed for 2 hours talking about bee behavior and soil chemistry and the particular quality of the wildflowers that grew on the back acreage in June. He did not talk about Preston Drury or Clifton Row or the water rights or any of what had happened at Wendell's office. He talked about bees. Lorena listened, asking questions when she had them, and found that by the end of the evening, she knew more about the ecology of 4 acres of eastern Kentucky land than she had known about anything that specifically belonged to her in a long time. When Clyde left, he said, "Orville knew this land the way most people know their own kitchen. Took him 30 years. You've got time." She wrote that down in her blue notebook that night, not because she needed the reminder, but because it was the kind of thing that deserved to be in a record. The Community Land Trust document, when Wendell finished it, ran to 11 pages. Lorena read every page. On the last one below the signature lines and the notary seal, Wendell had added a single line that was not legally required, but that he had included anyway. Established in memory of Orville James Castle, who kept the record. She read that line 3 times and did not say anything to Wendell about it when she saw him next. She did not need to, he already knew. The spring came late to eastern Kentucky that year. holding back through a cold March and a cautious April, and then arriving all at once in the first week of May with the force of something that had been accumulating for a long time. The redbuds came out on the ridge 2 days apart, which was fast, and the grass in Orville's yard went from brown to green in what felt like a single morning. On the Thursday before the May gathering, Agnes came by with a bundle of dried lemon balm from her own garden and stood in Orville's kitchen while Lorena made coffee and talked about nothing consequential for 20 minutes. It was the first time since November that they had spent time together without something needing to be decided or documented or protected. Agnes looked around the kitchen, which was warmer now, and smelled of the wood Lorena kept stacked by the stove, and said that the house looked like someone lived in it. "Someone does," Lorena said. Agnes nodded as if that settled something she had been waiting to confirm. Nadine Holston stopped by that same week with a jar of her own sourwood honey for the gathering table, and stayed long enough to tell Lorena something she had not mentioned before, that in the year before Orville died, he had asked her opinion about which of his regular participants would be willing to take on a leadership role in the arrangement if he was no longer able to manage it himself. Nadine had told him she did not know. He had said he thought he did. "He never told me who he was thinking of," Nadine said, "but I always assumed it was someone who kept a notebook." Lorena set the jar of honey on the counter and looked at it for a moment. "He knew you a long time," Nadine said, "longer than most people realize. You came to his clinic visits. You brought him things. He noticed." She picked up her coat from the back of the chair. Orville wasn't easy to know, but he was very careful about who he trusted. Once he decided, he didn't change his mind. After Nadine left, Lorena stood at the kitchen window and looked toward the barn. The door was straight in its frame, now the hinges holding true the way Clyde had said they would. The yard was green, and the cedar tree had put out new growth along the lower branches. From where she stood, she could see 3 of the hive boxes through the open barn door, their new frames in place, waiting. She thought about Orville standing in that barn doorway 4 months before he died, telling her she was the kind of person who checked on people. She had driven home with that sentence and not known what to do with it. Now she thought she understood it differently. He had not been paying her a compliment. He had been telling her what her job was going to be. Clyde Mabry and 2 other men from the trust spent 3 Saturdays on the barn. They did not attempt to restore it to what it had been. They repaired what needed repairing to make it functional: the worst section of the roof, the door frame that had dropped with the settling of the foundation, the east wall where the wood had gone soft with moisture. Clyde rehung the door himself, adjusting the hinges until the door swung true, which took most of one afternoon, and the kind of patience that Lorena recognized as the same patience that had gone into the honeycomb frames. He installed the 4 frames he had built for Orville in the first hive, along with 3 new ones that 2 of the younger men contributed. On a Saturday in the second week of May, with the red buds still in color along the ridge and the grass in the yard finally long enough to move in the wind, a man named Silas Drum, who had been keeping bees in the next county for 30 years, arrived with 2 nucleus colonies in ventilated boxes in the back of his truck. People came through the morning as Silas worked. Not all of them. Some were too old to travel, some had other obligations, and a few Lorena suspected were still unsure enough about the whole enterprise that they needed to see it survive its first season before they committed to appearing at it. But those who came did not arrive in any organized way. They came in pairs and alone, parking along the road, or in the yard, making their way to the old table Lorena had moved under the cedar tree near the east fence. She had covered it with a cloth and set out coffee and the things people bring to these occasions: cornbread, a jar of last year's preserved peaches, 2 kinds of cake. Nadine had brought sourwood honey from her own pantry, the good kind in a mason jar with the lid sealed in wax. Clyde arrived first, which surprised no one. He sat in the one chair that had arms and drank his coffee without ceremony and watched Silas work with the bees from a distance, the attention of one craftsman on another. When Silas adjusted the angle of a frame, Clyde nodded slightly, not commenting, just noting. Nola Fitch came with a neighbor who helped her across the uneven ground. She sat down and accepted coffee and looked out at the barn and the hives and the yard cleared of the tall grass that had claimed it for years. And she did not say what she was thinking, but she kept looking. Whatever she was seeing in the yard, it was more than what was in front of her. Alton Frey's son came without his father's coffee can this time, but with something else. A framed photograph, small, showing a man Lorena did not recognize, standing in front of a barn that looked like this barn taken in a different decade. He set it on the table without explaining it. No one asked him to explain it. Wendell Adcox arrived from town in his good shoes, which were unsuitable for the yard, and stood near the fence rather than cross the soft ground. He had brought the finalized documents in a folder. The community land trust was formally filed. The water rights were explicitly retained. Every name from Orville's notebooks that could be confirmed and had agreed to participate was recorded, and their participation was real in the way that only written things become permanently real. He gave Lorena the folder, and she looked at the first page, which had all the names in Wendell's careful legal type, and then the second page, which had the terms, and then she closed it and put it in her bag. Orville would have found something wrong with the language, Wendell said. He would have found something wrong with two things at least, Lorena said. Wendell almost smiled. She stood at the head of the table with the folder in her bag and the new beeswax smell coming from the open barn and the sound of Silas murmuring to his colonies in the low voice that beekeepers use. And she opened a clean notebook, one with a blue cover she had bought at the hardware store in town, and uncapped her pen. Agnes had been watching her from across the table. "You're going to write every name down again," Agnes said, "even though they're already in Wendell's file." "Yes," Lorena said. "Why?" Lorena thought about this. She thought about Orville's angular handwriting in notebooks kept over 20 years. She thought about the way Nola Fitch had placed her hand on the copied page when she saw her own name. She thought about Clyde's frames fitted and smoothed through a winter of patient work waiting to be used. She thought about Margaret Drury driving out here on Saturdays without telling anyone why. "Because Wendell's file is the legal record," she said. "This is something else." Agnes considered this. "What is it?" Lorena looked at the open page. "The part that doesn't disappear," she said. She wrote the first name at the top of the page, then the second, moving through the list with care and without rushing, because this kind of record required both. Around her, the morning continued, the coffee circulating, the conversation rising and falling, Silas narrating something about the colonies to Clayton in the technical shorthand of men who share a craft. When she finished the list, she dated the page and signed her name at the bottom. Not in Orville's format, in her own. Then she looked out at the barn, where the hive boxes stood in their repaired row, and at the yard, which was not beautiful but was no longer abandoned, and at the people sitting at the old table under the cedar tree. People who had kept their receipts through years of not knowing if anyone would ever ask to see them. And she understood something she had been moving toward since the morning she first stood in that parking lot and watched Preston Drury arrive 20 minutes too early, with too much certainty and too little patience. Orville had not left her something broken. He had left her something unfinished. And the difference between broken and unfinished was the whole story. Broken things need to be replaced. Unfinished things only need someone willing to continue. She had been that person before she knew it was required of her. That was why he had chosen her. Not because she was the most impressive person in his life, or the most connected, or the most resourceful, but because she was the kind of person who checked on people, who kept a notebook, who stayed in the hallway and waited and paid attention and did not sign the first paper someone put in front of her. He had known that. He had said it out loud once to her and to no one else on a cold afternoon in the doorway of this barn. She closed the notebook and put it in her bag alongside Wendell's folder. From inside the barn, Silas Drum said something quiet to the bees. The first one lifted from the frame, circled once in the warm May air, and found the morning.